So I got various things in this presentation. Just to start off, just a reminder that the weed control guide's out, and still do this every year with Illinois and Indiana. Most county offices, I don't think county offices are stocking anymore. Maybe there's some exceptions, but you can go to the Extension East store and get a PDF, or if you pay extra for the hard copy, you get the PDF with it. So weed populations right now, we focus always on what we call the big five: giant ragweed, mare's tail, water hemp, Palmer amaranth, and then common ragweed. And what we saw based on adoption, we've had sort of a continued increase in adoption of Liberty Link, and then we had a big adoption of Enlist and then Extend a few years ago. And some of that's shifting. There's some shuffling back and forth going on, obviously. But what we saw from our survey in 2019 going into 2020 was quite a drop in some of the weed problems we monitor, and an increase in weed-free fields. So we typically see weed-free fields about 50% in this survey, where we do 4,000 to 5,000 fields at the end of the season, soybean fields. And then we see numbers for giant ragweed and mare's tail, more like 20 to 30%. You can see they're down, and we have 74% of the fields weed-free. And typically in this, if we get 50% weed-free, that means there's another 25% that only have a few weeds, and then we have more fields. The rest that sort of have a major infestation of something. The exception to this is water hemp, which does continue to increase. If we went into 2021 thinking we had about the same adoption, our numbers actually of weed-free dropped back to where they typically are, and some of our other numbers came up a little bit. So it's a little bit hard to explain that. I guess it depends on what route we drive. And I mean, my perception was we had a pretty good year for weed control, but some of our county educators said not in their areas that had some tough issues. So our county educators do the same type of survey. They do 25 to 30 counties, depending on how many participate, because they just do a stretch of 100 fields, stretch of road that has 100 soybean fields on it or so. They tend to be harder on our weed populations because I think they sometimes inadvertently bias that towards a section of road where they know they have weeds. I'm not sure that's what's going on. So their number typically is like 30% weed free, and they went up to 41% between 19 and 20. And then their numbers on ragweed and mare's tail have been higher than this, and you can see they're down to 20 and 21%. They actually maintained that going in their survey going into 2021, which our survey didn't reflect that. So basically showing the adoption of technology, continued increase in water hemp, and so if you really look at our effectiveness of the new trait systems, I mean, I've shown you these rankings before, and even this winter, if you've been in another meeting, you've probably seen these. Because of the resistance we have, it's really difficult to grow non-GMO and Roundup Ready. I think you have to have a strategy. You have to have the right combination. Some weeds, once you hit a certain type of resistance, you're not going to get good control, for example, of, PPO resistant water hemp in a non-GMO system. And so you can see the range in how I rank those systems here from fair to good to poor to good. The new systems we really rate them excellent on mare's tail, giant ragweed, common ragweed, assuming you're using them the right way. And then for water hemp, we dropped to good for some of those, and that's just based on the fact that in XtendFlex and Enlist, you have the option to use dicamba and glufosinate. Even if you don't tank mix them, you have the option to make a couple applications and probably get better control of tough species. And I'll come back to that. Here's what our resistance looks like in a kind of a nutshell. Not every population follows this, but ALS resistance, which classic pursuit, all those type of products, all these are resistant to that largely. If you skip down to glyphosate, most of these populations, or a lot of them, are glyphosate resistant. And then if you skip down to PPO, which is Flexstar Cobra, that's site 14. We do have PPO resistance in common ragweed, and we have some common ragweed populations with multiple combinations of those resistances. And then we have a considerable amount of water hemp that can have PPO resistance. We've sort of taken the pressure off of Flexstar and Cobra really with our adoption of new technology. So I'm not sure it's still increasing, but if it's in a population and that population spreading, it's certainly getting around. And then we screened water hemp for some other herbicides. I'll talk about that at the end. So we've picked up at least variable response to auxin herbicides, group 4, which is 2,4-D and dicamba. We screened for 2,4-D, so we picked up some populations that have reduced response. PS2, number 5, is atrazine metribuzin. We have resistance in water hemp there in some populations. What we call probably resistance to acetamides like metolachlor and pyroxasulfone, and then also for HPPD like mesotrione. We definitely had populations that survived a use rate, and in some cases a higher rate than that. What we didn't do is follow through and look at heritability and dose response and things like that you need to do absolutely categorize resistance. But we definitely have picked up a trend where we have some populations with reduced response to those. And so when you come back to our rankings of those new systems, and I say, okay, they're excellent, they're good, or whatever, that assumes you're really using the right type of system, and especially in a year when certain products are in short supply, and there's a tendency to oversimplify. What that does for these weeds is start to reduce control to begin with, and these are really good weeds. They're a problem not just because they develop resistance, they have extended emergence, they have rapid growth, they do well in our tillage systems. So you have various things going on. So, what we consider to be the right system, all of these, the Maristate and giant ragweed are almost always burned down herbicides, so you have to do the right thing there. Common ragweed, maybe, depending if what you have and what's the time of planting. And then water hemp and palmer are not usually burn down weeds, or if they are, they're just extremely small. We expect that, to get control of these, you need a spring residual in with a burn down. That's sort of non-negotiable for us. We don't really want to have that conversation with people about whether they use residual or not. And then all these are going to require a post component, and that's where those new systems come in. Some of the other differences here are that Maristate does really benefit from a fall burn down, fall herbicide application. With the systems we have, the combination of a better burn down in some cases with a better post emergence, you don't necessarily have to have a fall application for Maristate, but what happens there if you don't is it tends to put more pressure on your burn down herbicides, and then if you get late, it gets wet and things like that, you can start to struggle, I think. Giant ragweed, when you look at the post management, one of our big errors with giant ragweed is we only want to spray post emergence herbicides once, and now we have 2,4-D and dicamba, which actually are effective in that. Liberty not quite as much, and it comes up into July, and so depending on the year and whether your pre-emergence herbicides worked, really the best way to reduce giant ragweed populations is with a second post. And then I should say, spraying the first one when the giant ragweed is 6 to 8 inches tall and coming back 3 weeks later, instead of waiting until it's 10 to 25 inches tall. Water hemp and palmer, the addition to the burn down, the residual in the post is you can add a residual to the post, and they do respond to that, like metolachlor or peroxysulfone. The other herbicides, you really can't do that. You can't put a herbicide out there post that gives you any residual, and then depending on what happens, you can you have the possibility of a second post. So that for those weeds, water hemp and palmer. So that's what we consider appropriate management. That's not saying it's always easy to implement, but once someone backs off from really what the appropriate system is, combined with the herbicide resistance, we either we start to lose some control, or we just put a lot of pressure on these new systems, and then you have the possibility of increased development of resistance, I think. I can't move. Am I not moving forward here? There we go. Hang on. Sorry. So, relative to our current glyphosate shortage, one of the issues that comes up, I think, is we use glyphosate in spring burn down, and we include it in a lot of post-emergence treatments. The comment, I think, often comes up that glyphosate's just a grass herbicide anymore. And that's because by the time you put a system together to really control glyphosate resistance in Maristate, giant ragweed, common whiteweed, and water hemp, it has to be a strong enough system that the glyphosate's not really doing any good on those particular weeds. Now, glyphosate's out there for grass, it's out there for other weeds that can escape. If you have other perennials, it's helpful on those. So I think there's a thinking that, well, I could just swap in clethodim for post-emergence for glyphosate. And that's probably true in a lot of cases. If everything works really well, these are the weeds that you have out there that, along with grass, that you're really trying to control. I would say that given that, if your residual doesn't work as well as it really should, then you're going to probably wish you had the glyphosate in there for some other weeds. And then in the burn down, I think glyphosate in the burn down is really still the broadest spectrum, best burn down herbicide we have. It has to be augmented for control of certain weeds. But really that's where you have more of an issue. And so The comment's been made in the middle of this shortage or whatever's going on that I really need to save glyphosate for the burn down, and I think I can do without it post. And I think that's in a lot of cases probably the right. We have typically recommended, and I think is pretty common, is without a fall treatment, glyphosate with 2,4-D or dicamba or Sharpen, one of the saflufenicil products, or Revitine you can throw in there, or combinations of those. Really, they're not necessarily perfect. Glyphosate plus 2,4-D can still miss overwintered mare's tail and struggle with dandelion and things like that. The Gramoxone 2,4-D metribuzin is a great mix, and I'm focusing on soybeans here, obviously. And then you can put glufosinate in there, but glufosinate by itself is kind of a rotten burn down herbicide for various reasons. But with the right herbicides, it can work relatively well. So if you look at all the herbicides that actually have some burn down activity for beans, I mean, there's a bunch here. It's just that not one of them by themselves will really do what we need them to do. And so when you take glyphosate out of this, one of the things I think we need to think about is, okay, what kind of I want to still err on the side of complexity in my burn down. So, am I going to be able to get away with just 2,4-D or dicamba? Probably not. But if I can add Sharpen to that, saflufenicil in some way, you've got some activity from Clemuron that's in canopy, like a canopy plus Gramoxone plus 2,4-D can be a good mix. You've got some help from metribuzin by itself, some from imazethapyr, which is Pursuit. So I think the burn down is a tougher place to take glyphosate out, and certainly we need to be thinking about what's our mix to get that level of control. If you do a fall treatment, I mean, even if you don't have any residual in the fall, and most residual products applied in the fall don't last into the spring anyway, Clemuron's about the only one that really does to any extent. I mean, it just opens you up to probably have any kind of burn down. So you can allot the money and redistribute your herbicides there. So you do, $5 or $8 worth of herbicide in the fall and clean that up so you have a much easier time in the spring. And that field on the left, which had a burn down treatment, a plot, that's a plot that probably 2,4-D would be fine, or even canopy with metribuzin with crop wool, or a little bit of something would probably be fine there. In the middle, the strips on the edge are the the outside of the plot, outside between the plots, versus the one on the right, which is kind of a typical burn down situation, which gets worse if we get wet and delayed. And so, that's going to require generally more herbicide. You're not going to be able to get away with them. So if you have, what's my efficacy of these products, glyphosate resistant weeds, that's maybe a little bit harsh of 2,4-D on mare's tail, but if it survived the burn down, especially, that's kind of a tough situation. If it's coming up new, then that's after planting, then that's probably more like an 8 at least, but you can see generally good control. However, if you start having some other weeds escape your residual, or for whatever reason, you decide not to use a residual, or it just doesn't work because you didn't get rain on it, then you can start to see that these struggle a little bit with some other weeds and aren't necessarily good enough. So that's a case where if you omit the glyphosate and swap in clethodim select or something like that, you may start to see some misses on some of those weeds. So it comes back to this table again, where you're trying to always build a system for these weeds, which are tough and have tough life cycles, of complementary herbicide applications, I should say multiple herbicide applications that take the pressure off of each other, so that you want your residual to take the pressure off of your post, so that, you can come back with a program that doesn't use glyphosate. You want the fall burn down to take the pressure off your spring burn down. So you have, things that are helping each other out. Anytime you oversimplify and try to get back with minimum applications, it just basically puts a lot of stress on the herbicide program. And these are weeds that are pretty resilient in the face of oversimplification of programs.